Hello and good day. I hope this video finds you well. I'm Jordy Coleman, and welcome to my Comedy Corner. Let me tell you a little bit of a story. This may be hard to believe, but the world of stand-up comedy did not start off the way it is now. Nowadays, every major city has at minimum 2 comedy clubs. Chances are they also have some sort of venue that tries to feature comedy as much as possible, whether it's a really kicking open mic night or whether it's a theater. Some towns have so many comedy clubs it's ridiculous. Back in the 50s and 60s, there was very few comedy clubs. So if you were a stand-up comedian, chances are your main venues were going to be burlesque houses and strip clubs. Imagine, if you will, being in a strip club one night with some of your friends, and the dancer leaves the stage. And all of a sudden a guy comes on. Now, I'm sure he would have been announced, here's your comedian for the evening. Imagine sitting in the audience and watching a man walk out in nothing but a bow tie and proceed to give a monologue. Then at one point during his act, he stops, noticing a knothole in the stage. Taking a few moments to chastise the management of said establishment, because that would be a health and safety hazard for anyone dancing in high heels. And finishing off his rant by pissing in said knothole, thus making it pretty much impossible for management to ignore it. This is a story presented and that has been passed around about Lenny Bruce. No idea how factual it actually is, but I will say this much. Number one, knowing his personality, it's probably not that far off. And number two, this would show a little bit of a heads up to what Lenny Bruce would be most known for. Now, based off of the time frame, I'm sure you probably established Lenny Bruce passed away some time ago. Unfortunately, when he passed away, he was only 40 years old, which is incredibly sad. Some people make the argument that it was a conspiracy. I'm not so sure about that, but regardless, he also died of a heroin overdose, like so many great funny people have. Now, I would base his longevity as a 5 out of 10. That would be because the people that still know him still respect him, because he was a man who was willing to stand up for what he believed was right. And the main thing that he believed was right was equality, regardless of gender and regardless of race. I personally don't have a whole lot of history with him. Matter of fact, I found out about him because of watching Joe Rogan's podcast. So a quick 2 out of 10 for the nostalgia factor. Adding to that, a lot of his material doesn't still hold up nowadays. So 2 out of 10 for laughter I'm out, which means I did at least laugh somewhat. And 2 out of 10 for how well it holds up. But the comedy is not so much the important factor when it comes to Lenny Bruce, because his fan base, which is a 5 out of 10, really shows that even though not a whole lot of people remember him, the little group of people that do remember him pretty fondly. So even with all that being said, 5 out of 10 on the enjoyment level is kind of amazing for how little I laughed. Though the reason why I enjoyed it as much as I did is very simple. He took a stance, which is something that very few people nowadays, it seems, are willing to do. To fight for what he thought was correct. A big chunk of Lenny Bruce's friends were jazz musicians, thus meaning that they were African American. And he did not fully understand or comprehend exactly why he could do certain things that his friends weren't allowed to. As interesting as that is, he stood up and stood shoulder to shoulder with his friends, going so far as to actually go on TV and talk about how, yes, he's an offensive person, but things do offend him. Words like segregation. I can say this much. That is very relatable to a person like me. Now, for those of you who are somewhat familiar with my material, I'm not typically a profanity-using comedian. It's not so much a choice that I've made, it's I'm in my comfort zone on stage, and I don't feel the need to use a lot of profanity. I have nothing against it, but Lenny Bruce, in a sense, kind of knew how to use it the right way at the time. He had an understanding that words had power, and it's really up to the people to decide how much power these words should have. And he also had an understanding that sometimes the wrong words have power. Now, you can make the argument of context on this, and I wouldn't say that you were particularly wrong. As we know from the 7 words you can't say on TV and the 7 words you can't say on the radio, which was a bit initially written by Lenny Bruce, we do put value on certain words. That being said, he had an understanding which does lead him to be at least somewhat intelligent. So 5 out of 10 on that. His timing was a tiny bit lackluster for my tastes, on a 4 out of 10 on that. But his mic control, 6 out of 10, because I'll tell you this much. During his day and age, and even to today, when he talked, people listened. And people listened extremely closely. Now, Lenny Bruce was one of the last people actually arrested in North America for profanity. And he used that to demonstrate how, if you can be arrested for things that you say, you do not have a freedom of speech. And I agree with that. I do agree with the factor that you have freedom of speech, you do not have freedom of consequence. There is a big thing to understand in this chunk. If you say something that people don't have a tendency of agreeing with, they cannot outright silence you. But if you say that particular message on Twitter, and Twitter decides, I don't like the fact that you said that, so you're kicked off Twitter. Twitter is still a company, and they have the right to choose whether or not they want to be associated with things that you're saying or not. Yes, freedom of speech opens up a door to hatred. But just because somebody says something that you don't particularly care for does not mean we can close that door for everybody. And the truth is that if you close that door on one person, you are closing it for everybody. You're always going to hear things and see things that you don't particularly agree with. And that is your right to not agree with it. And it is also your right to use your freedom of speech to speak out against it. That is exercising freedom of speech for both yourself and for the person that you're disagreeing with. Personally speaking, I feel you can disagree with people on very specific topics. Personally speaking, I feel that you can still disagree with somebody and still have a respect for them and still treat them with respect because they are, in fact, still a human being. But I also understand that sometimes people do and say things that are so detestable that you just don't even know how to formulate a sentence to respond. There are very few people left in this world like Lenny Bruce who are willing to take a stand for something they believe in, regardless of the consequences they find themselves in. And that's kind of sad. But maybe even if just a small number of people are willing to take a small lesson and learn that we all have our own power to speak out against atrocities, especially a lot of the things that are happening right now, then people can stay free. Stop being silent about the problems they're having. There's a very specific reason why I chose Lenny Bruce as the first person to talk about, and it's because he was a person who was willing to take a stand and fight for his cause, regardless of the consequences. And he paid for those consequences repeatedly. Some would argue he's still paying those consequences to this day, even after he died. Simply because not many people know who he was. He was willing to take that chance. And I have to give at least a little bit of respect. Truth be told, I give a lot of respect to somebody who's willing to stand up for something that they feel is more important than even themselves. But that's it for this time. Thank you for watching. Do all the YouTube things. And until next time, take care and keep laughing.